Thrilled to have you here today and thrilled to have this panel to present to us. I'm Christine Russell, and I am the ULI Cincinnati District Council Chair. In my spare time, I work at Northern Kentucky Triad as the Vice President of Strategy. And again, just want to welcome you all. If you're not a member of ULI, we would love to have you as a member. You do get a discount on events like this and the 18-Hour City Series. We also host a lot of member-only events that non-members are not able to attend. We would encourage you to look into it. If you have any questions, you can come talk to me, Lydia Jacobs-Horton, our Executive Director, or Kim Fantasi, our Coordinator. We're unable to support these programs without the generous support of our sponsors. Their logos will be rolling on the PowerPoint. Just please take a moment to acknowledge those. And if you are one of our sponsors, we thank you very graciously. We do have a program sponsor, and that is Taft Law, who allows us to use this space, and we're very appreciative of their support. So I want to introduce our two moderators today, and then they will take care of introducing our panelists. First is Stasiu Geleszinski, and he is the Managing Director of Capstone Cincinnati office. He has experience in a wide variety of commercial real estate sectors and financing types, and he is joined by his colleague, Sherief Gouda, who is a Senior Advisor at Capstone. And he has a very deep experience in the Midwest multifamily market. So these two guys are very well qualified to MC this panel and to present this very interesting topic. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn this over to Sash and Sherief.
Thank you, Christine. On behalf of Capstone, can you guys hear me back there? All right. On behalf of Capstone, ULI, of course, our esteemed panel, I want to thank you guys for being here and, of course, making this a sold-out show. This speaks not only to the smaller size of the room we chose, but also the fact that everybody here is making a conscious effort to learn more about their city and their craft. As the title states, on one of these screens in a moment.
Let's move this slide along.
Exactly. Today's event is going to be about public fence for private development. Regardless of what your opinion is on arguing about certain developments in the area, I will say this. After talking about today why we may need this, things that happen because of it, or perhaps challenges on both sides, we want you guys to be able to walk away with the understanding of a lot of what around you when you walk through the city wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the public and private sector working together with the same goal of just making our community a better place to live and work. I'll now hand it off to Stash to go over the panel.
Great. Thank you, Sherief. And we only do apartments, so wide commercial real estate is a bit of a stretch. But thanks, everybody, for being here. The format of today is going to be very conversational. We had an opportunity to sit with each one of the participants and go through their perspective and come up with some questions. So they each have copies of the questions, and we're just going to run through it like that. And if you have maybe an additional question or follow-up, feel free to raise your hand if we can get to you. I'll just give a little bit of background on how we came to be here with this great panel. We were tasked with an assignment valuing an asset that had a tax abatement on it, and we didn't really know how to handle it. So we went out to the development community and said, how do you value these things and how do you select your discount rate? And we got a great set of responses back. And then Lydia was kind enough to invite us to host the panel. So that's a little bit of the background of the how and the why of why we're here. I guess as we get started, I think our first question, our initial question was going to be at the back of the panel, but given yesterday that the mayor and the school board agreed on a new deal. Richard, how is the new agreement agreed to yesterday different than the previous one, and what are the ramifications of that new agreement?
Can everybody hear me okay? All right. I was just going to use the mic. Sure, never a problem. Richard Tranter with Dinsmore Shohl. And I thank Stash for the first question. because apparently the mayor isn't going to announce the new agreement at 4 o'clock. And I joked with him, I said, do you not have a copy of the agreement, which has not been announced yet, but I'm going to make a couple of educated guesses as to the difference between the two agreements. I want to thank Tom Demaropoulos for letting me look at his story, because I'm going to take a couple facts out of the story. Just by way of background, what we're talking about is the 1999 CPS agreement that was agreed to, and it really formed up as a result of the stadium projects. They were trying to capture the tax abatement that was lost as a result of the stadium development, and they came up with a number of $5 million. Because that'll be relevant. I'll actually tie this together as I take you through my world of security here. The other component was, it was I believe 24-25, or it was 24, 25, 27 were the percentages. I saw in the article it was 25, 27 in terms of the percentages for the abatements that were eligible, and it couldn't be 24. It doesn't matter, because apparently it's going to 33%. The percentage payment has increased, and so as I understand, it has increased to 33% in terms of the make-whole payment. And again, if I'm using terms, and I'm going to have to do this very quickly because the other panel members would like to have a chance to speak, but I just want to let you know that the new agreement appears to be, they've increased the school participation to 33%. They've eliminated the $5 million annual payment, which was a payment by the City of Cincinnati to CPS to offset compensation lost as a result of the stadium projects. That's how far back that number, that was its lineage, was from the stadium development. And then you always got to remember, you don't have to worry about this if you're at 10 years or 75% or less. If you're doing abatements, CRA or abatements, and your term is 10 years or less, you're not going to get involved with the school district. If your abatement is 75% or less in terms of percentage, you're not going to get involved with the school district. What we're talking about is when you cross 10 years, when you cross 75% on a project, and you're still seeking an abatement, the school district says you've just triggered a statutory provision, you have to negotiate, and what the city has done is this evergreen agreement, which is meant to be a comprehensive agreement. It expired in December 31st, and that's why you've seen in the stories what is going forward. We anticipate at 4 o'clock, I'm guessing, if I'm wrong, you can blame me. I think it's going to be at 33%, and I think the 5-year payment has gone away. That's the easiest way to digest it.
Perfect.
Right. And as a lawyer, I'm totally uncomfortable with this because I have no reference point other than Tom Demaropoulos, thank you very much, on your story.
I don't know how to turn this on. Oh, right here. Check. No? All right. Test. Okay, good. So I will introduce the panel. That was Shreve's job, but it's okay. We have Phil Denning with the City of Cincinnati to represent the municipalities. We have Dan Schimberg with Uptown Rental Properties, an esteemed developer. Gregg, also an esteemed developer. He's with Capital Investment Group. These two guys represent developers for the room and the panel. We have Kyle Neumann, who is with Bellwether Enterprise and is a financier. He's a mortgage broker, mortgage banker, and has worked on several of these projects and experience, and we wanted him. And then Richard Tranter, who is our legal expert on the panel. Thank you all once again. And our next question for the panel, both philosophically and from a capital stack perspective, why do we need tax abatements and TIF agreements? Dan? Here, I'll trade you. Yeah, that's it.
Hello. For me, anyway, and I'll speak for our projects, our difficult urban infill projects that tend to be, the land is very expensive, the dense garages are very expensive, but for the tax abatement, the returns would not be sufficient enough to attract investment. That's a really simple part of it. The other piece that's really important is we might be able to do it without a tax abatement by building a square vinyl-sided box. And for us, when you're doing tight urban infill, high-end Class A development where the architecture is important and the longevity of the product is really important, it cannot be done but for the tax abatement. And a lot of times when people ask me about tax abatement, I say the building is going to last 50, 75, 100 years past when the tax abatement expires. And the city doesn't want a product that we would build without the tax abatement if we still had to hit our threshold of investment.
I think one of the other things that's critical today is that, as Dan said, parking has become a huge issue. It's likely that parking demand might go down over the next 10 to 20 years, but right now, at least in this marketplace, parking is still very important. And in most cases, a lot of these deals just can't afford the cost of, as you said, structured parking. We're just getting ready to start a deal in the Kenwood area, and we can't charge for parking out there, at least for office space for sure. And yet, based on the cost of land and the locations that you want, you have to provide that structured parking. And the rents that we're able to get just won't support it. And if you look at office rents downtown, they're the same today as they were 10 or 15 years ago. But construction costs obviously have gone up significantly. And as Dan said, the cost to build a basic box is a pretty high number today. And in order to make the capital stack work, you just have to have some public involvement in these deals.
Yeah, we joke around in our office a lot of times that you are a parking garage away from making a project work on a number of occasions. Without the participation of the Port Authority and the city through tax abatements and tax increment financing, a lot of the garages you see that serve as podiums for apartment structures and the office structure that's going to be going up on the MLK interchange, it would never happen. That infrastructure improvement has to be paid for publicly. If you start to do the math on what it costs to build a garage versus where parking rates are today, you would never get paid back for building that garage. And to Dan's point about the quality of construction, we're very fortunate in our community in that our communities demand quality, but also our owners demand quality. We've got a lot of very good developers that are long-term owners in the city that want to build projects that will last, not just for their generation, but for the generations after them. And that takes partnership with your communities in the city to be able to build those projects.
Phil, maybe you could contribute from the municipality side.
Sure, certainly. Thanks for having me here, and nice to meet a couple of the other panelists I hadn't met yet. I've talked before with other folks, whether they're council members or otherwise. For those in the room that have gone through the process of asking for city incentive, raise your hand if it was fun and if it was as fast as you like. I didn't see any go up. And so in a perfect world, the city wouldn't have to use its tools to make a property move and to make private investment happen. And the private development community doesn't want to do that either, because there's just a lot of uncertainty that's involved in the process of getting a tax abatement. But at least from the perspective of the city of Cincinnati, the perspective we have is that we've been more blighted and disinvested for a very long time than most of our, not just our regional competitors, but of course our national urban competitors. And the state of Ohio, this local city council, has given us tools to make a change in that regard. And so our perspective is the tools that we can use that are, especially when they cost no money to the city and they incentivize private investment, those are the ones that we want to use. And we want to, of course, minimize the amount of pain it takes and maximize the efficiency and the way that process works. But at the end of the day, the goal is private investment and revitalize communities and neighborhoods. And these are tools we have to make that happen. And in the city of Cincinnati's case, for the vast majority of projects that we use these tools for, it doesn't cost any money. So those are my thoughts.
I think we'll get into that a little bit later. We had a pre-interview basically with all of these panelists, and it was a great time on each, and so we'll get there. Richard, go ahead.
No, I wanted to follow your comment because 30 years ago, to the developers in the room that remember those days, the municipalities, the townships, the counties wanted us to all solve, Common Developers Council wanted us to solve all their infrastructure needs, stormwater, road widenings, and we all knew it was a public benefit. It wasn't specific to just our project site. The benefit of the TIFs and the abatements and, as you said, all the other tools is it has actually allowed for a softening of the negotiations because now it's a collaborative effort. Because before, you would become loggerheads where you were going to build a shopping center or an office park, and the infamous traffic study would come out, and it would be used to justify like an I-75 ramp or something in a 5-acre development. How did I become the burden on the highway? So I, as a very adamant negotiator on behalf of the developers, I like the fact that I've got other avenues to talk with the city or the municipality to say, look, it's a common problem, we'll contribute, but we have to have a vehicle. And that's why the TIF, I think, and the abatement have been a big advantage for basically the 3 Ps now, as we call them. That was never the term 30 years ago, but private-public partnership is definitely the way that development moves today.
I like that.
Great, thank you. Does everybody understand what a TIF or a tax abatement is, generally in the room?
Let's have.
Okay. It's like a discount on your taxes for a certain amount of time. Think of it like that.
There are materials on your desk. They're scattered. There are 3 different sets. There is a shorthand sort of description of the terms that are being used, and then there is identification of the projects in 2019 that involve public money. Again, thank you, Cincinnati Business Courier. I probably plagiarized half your stories in there. And then there's also a little bit of analysis of procedures and policies. There may be something there that is helpful.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
That's why we asked you here. Thank you. Our next question, if you're willing and able, maybe the panelists could share some of the projects that we might all know here in town or otherwise that you've used public funds on, with, and maybe how that helped move it forward and what form that took.
I think for us, VP3, which is a project located on Short Vine, stands out in my mind because it has a 2-story parking garage, and part of the 2004 urban renewal plan of Short Vine, when it was at its rock bottom, called for increased public parking to help support the business district, ultimately when there were enough residents there to support it. And so VP3, that building, which houses about 350 people, in the urban renewal plan called for housing to be built for about 1,500 people minimum to really help the resurgence of the business district. When we were planning that building and had acquired that land at about $1.5 million an acre, we went to the city and said, we're getting ready to build a building here. We need a 1-story parking garage underneath the building. If you guys are willing to build a story of parking, we can check the box of the additional public parking that's going to be taken. In that case, the city paid a little bit of the land, a little bit of the structure, and the city actually owns one of the 2 parking levels. We set up a condominium structure in the parking garage itself. And so that particular piece, that was a lead development, so we had a 15-year tax abatement, and there's a city parking garage there that the city still owns and runs and manages and collects a lot of revenues. Basketball games, football games, Bogarts, FC soccer for now, but events that are taking place in the Uptown, that's a really active garage. And so that was an example where the city really helped foot the bill because the land was outrageous and we all benefited. The city got a parking garage less expensive than they would have ever been able to build that. We were able to recoup some of the land costs and some of the structure costs with that. So that was a really effective public-private partnership.
And to just put like an emphasis on, that's a deal that wouldn't have been able to really come to fruition had it not been for the public participation.
That deal would not have happened, number one, and number two, Short Vine wouldn't have had the public parking that it has today as well.
That's great. Thank you. Gregg?
Yeah, I'll give you the example that we're still working on, hope to finish in the next couple of days, but we're doing a mixed-use project in Kenwood that includes about 250 apartments, 130,000 square foot office building, 130-room hotel, 2 restaurants, and an 800-car parking garage. We closed the TIF bonds on December 30th, and that has about a $22 million TIF included in the deal, and that's basically the cost to do the garage and the public infrastructure. We have to do signalization on Kenwood Road. We've got a wide in the side street, and we're building an 800-car parking garage, which obviously on the office side, which the office tenants will occupy most of those parking spaces, you can't charge office tenants for parking. There's no revenue stream that enables that parking garage to be built without a CRA or in this case, a TIF. This is the first TIF we've done. It was not easy, and it took a long time, and it's very expensive, but it was that piece that was needed to make the project a success. We could not have done it without that. The other one that I'll just mention quickly, we finished a couple of years ago a project on the Kentucky side of the river called Aqua on the Levee, and that's a mixed-use project with a hotel, apartments, vacant retail space, and a garage. And again, the cost to do that development just would not support the garage. That's about, again, I think almost 900 space parking garage, one level of which is owned by Newport on the Levee because they had owned the land previously and it was a surface parking lot until the development was done. The interesting thing is Northern Kentucky is they don't have TIFs in Kentucky except for 2 or 3 super TIFs that actually Bill Butler pushed through the state legislature in order to get ovation done. For little guys like us, we have to use a pilot program, payments in lieu of taxes, through an industrial revenue bond issuance, which is an artificial way to grant a tax abatement, but we do have to go before the school board in order to make that happen. So it's a negotiated settlement there. And in fact, in Sycamore Township for the Kenwood deal, that is also a negotiated settlement with the school board. Unlike some of the agreements in the city and with the new agreement with CPS, those are pretty much, to a certain extent, automatic. And these 2 jurisdictions, we had to negotiate with the school board in both cases.
That's great. I didn't know that pilot stood for payments in lieu of taxes. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm learning every day. You still can teach an old dog new tricks.
That's great. That's great. Let's see. Our next question.
Can I answer, Stash?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, actively, we're working on a number of different projects around town, all of which are getting public subsidy or assistance in some manner, both in Madisonville, College Hill, Uptown, over in Covington, and really we've exhausted all the tools in the tool belts, and development margins still continue to get squeezed, and the tools being district TIF, project-based TIF, tax abatements. Over in Covington, it's the industrial revenue bond program that Gregg had mentioned. So those are, that Port's capital lease structure is now being incorporated into all of the different projects that are happening. We haven't really even touched on what that is, but that's a mechanism in which you're saving sales tax on materials. And all of the developments that we're seeing and working on, we really have to use all of those tools to get them to completion. If not, the value of the project wouldn't support building it, the cost of construction. We haven't even got into different funds through Joe and his group that we use, as well as new market tax credits as well. So all of the tricks are being used to get good projects done here in town.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question is broad. It's for the panel. Dan, I think we touched on it specifically when we had coffee, but I'll let the whole panel address it. How is Cincinnati doing now, today, in 2020, versus 10 or even 20 years ago?
I think you've got some data on this, right?
Maybe not in my brain. The city administration actually just furnished a report to council. It was really very thorough, about 60 pages long, and it digs into this question. With the city council was elected, current slate of city council was elected a couple of years ago, and there's been a lot of ongoing questions from council members, but also just the general public about, obviously, this topic. I think we've all seen the headlines. Thank you, Tom, and others. And it's an important topic. I think In our experience, the reality is that the City of Cincinnati proper, that's all I can talk about here, we're doing way better than we ever have been in terms of development momentum, vacant buildings being renovated, neighborhoods like Madisonville that 10 years ago, who would have thought what's going on in Madisonville could happen? But the other reality is that we are doing less well than our competitors still. And I think that's a really crucial point. It's one thing to say, hey, we're doing great compared to 10 years ago. That's only comparing to ourselves. The reality is that capital flows, and it flows to where there are fewest barriers. And if you're in Indianapolis and property taxes are much lower, then capital goes there. Or if you're in the city of Columbus, they're building 4 times more new units than the city of Cincinnati has over the past few years. And so those are much more real challenges. We're doing great, and the wind's in our sails, but there's less wind. We're catching less of the wind than Columbus is, or Indianapolis, or another place. And there's been a lot of comparisons to what's going on in other places on the coasts. I try not to engage in that conversation where it's a very different place, the market's very different. What was mentioned, even our other competitors like Nashville, you can build office space in Nashville and get $32 a square foot. It's a little bit easier to finance than here in Cincinnati where you can get much less than that. And so we're doing great, but I think that there's always room for improvement. And the way that development is happening, the manner in which it happens, there's a whole other panel about that. But I guess that's how I started.
Yeah, and really just to add on to that, what's interesting is you're seeing around Cincinnati and areas where there is incentive like this is you simply, when you're venturing into Madisonville or venturing into Mount Auburn, as we are now and others have ventured into neighborhoods that have really seen no private investment for decades. Mount Auburn is 50, 60 years since there's been meaningful private investment flowing into these neighborhoods that have always been considered marginal. Venture into neighborhoods within the city of Cincinnati that have really not seen that kind of investment, and it would not be happening but for those programs.
That's great.
What's interesting, I think, about the things that we have to do as a region, when I compare it to some other locations, we have a project under construction right now in Orlando, and we have no public funds involved in that. We have a 350 space structured parking garage. But it's interesting, the hard costs there are 12 to 15% less than they are here. And the rents that we get there are probably 10 to 12 cents a square foot higher than what I can get here. And so when you take those two things into account, it's pretty easy to see why we need that public involvement to get things going here today.
Do you think that's due to the geography of Cincinnati, the topography, or is labor just cheaper down there, materials cheaper?
Materials not significantly different, but labor is absolutely less expensive in those markets. And historically, and even today, there is more construction overall. I think the level of skill is a little better. We found here that we don't have nearly as many large subcontractors to do particular facets of the construction. And I think overall, we're seeing that the trades are less skilled than they were 5 to 7 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And there are a lot of things that have to be redone, and that drives up cost. And every day extra that you go because of those things that have to be redone drives up cost even more.
Overages and such.
I would also say, and I don't know if this is true, but our projects in Orlando, Tallahassee, and Myrtle Beach, there wasn't near the demand for the quality of architecture. They trying to fit into the urban core in the city of Cincinnati where there is a lot of historic buildings, a lot of masonry buildings, there's a lot of beautiful infrastructure and buildings that are left over, making those things feel, our new buildings feel appropriate there. It's much more challenging than the work we were doing in the southeast that I said. Now, our project in Charleston, totally different scenario there, but I don't know how you felt about that in your Orlando project.
I think that's absolutely true when you look at urban versus suburban, no question. And most of what you're doing is more urban. We've also done some suburban deals, but the cost, regardless of how detailed the architecture is, just continues to increase. And of course, the tariffs killed everybody for a while with respect to granite countertops, and quartz, and all that stuff. And so it just makes it very difficult to have any of these things pencil out today.
That's great. Thank you, guys. The title of the panel is Using Public Funds to Accelerate Private Development. How have, and this aimed more at the developers, but if the other panelists have input, I'd love to hear it. How have you worked with Mount Auburn or Kenwood or Newport or any of the other neighborhoods that you guys have been in to move them forward, maybe despite their best efforts?
I'll be glad to jump in on that one. It's a real smorgasbord in terms of what you get. I did a deal out in Eastgate about 6 years ago, I guess now, and the guy who's a township administrator for Union Township is a really good guy. And I walked in and I said, here's what we want to do in this little site just down the road from Jungle Gyms. And he looked at me and he said, Greg, he said, if you'd come in here 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have let you sit down. Today, I'm going to tell you, put as many units as you can there. He clearly understood that rooftops were critical, and we did a CRA, so an abatement on that project, and the township trustees and the township administrator were great to work with. They understood what the end benefit was, and so it made complete sense for them to get involved in, again, a public-private partnership. In Sycamore Township, the project that we're hopefully going to break ground on next week was just the opposite. It was a struggle from day one. It was very difficult to get the township trustees and other folks, both at the township level and the county level, to understand what we believed was the importance of this project. And so it was much more difficult. We ended up succeeding at the end of the day, but it was a long and arduous battle.
Just every municipality has its own level of sophistication and touch points that you got to pay attention to. City of Cincinnati, very sophisticated. They have programmatically, here's what you can do under the guidelines that we have, and you go through the process of getting it done. You have to get community approval and sign off. Other smaller municipalities have lesser sophistication at times. And there's an education process that goes into the why behind why you're going in there and trying to do what you're going to do and what you're asking for. We had a project that we're working on in a suburban township recently, and we had all of the township commissioners were on board, the township staff was on board, the county was on board, and then when it came to a township meeting, the whole neighborhood showed up wearing the same colored T-shirts with pitchforks yelling and screaming. And spooked the township administrators very quickly. And then it's back to the drawing board on trying to explain why it is that you're trying to do what you're going to do. So it varies based on which place you go to.
One thing I've been working on with municipalities over a long period of time, and Cincinnati has gotten much, much better, is the whole concept of doing things sequentially versus concurrently. And for years in Cincinnati, you couldn't start working on the second task until the first task was 100% complete, and it drew out the time period needed to work through these kind of pre-development pieces. You couldn't start working on the CRA or the tax abatement until you had the neighborhood approval, and it became this kind of chicken and egg for a long time because, well, you don't really know if you have a project until you have all the boxes checked. And in Tallahassee specifically, we really made a lot of headway where they redid a lot of their pre-development protocol, so that you could be working with various departments and the communities all at the same time, and everything kind of converges and you're ready to build the building versus having to check each box sequentially.
That's interesting, the consecutive nature of checking each box versus let's just try and knock them all out as quickly as possible. Anybody else? Richard?
My comment is, at one point I studied all the zoning jurisdictions about 15 years ago with Ron Miller, who was then executive director for regional planning, and he always thought it was an oxymoron, regional planning. There were 49 separate zoning jurisdictions just in Hamilton County. We're highly balkanized, like these gentlemen I have a practice across the country, and I can go to South Carolina, North Carolina, and it's more regionalized. And also those areas they're more suburban development, the projects I'm looking at for my clients. But the difficulty, it's the good news, bad news. It's local. That's the good news. The bad news, it's local. You don't know until you walk into that public hearing, and it could be with a community council for the city, whether you got 5 people there or you've got 20, and what their opposition is, who they're connected to. So I think we all recognize it's inherently a very political process. You got to have thick skin. I think there's a real nexus between the law, politics, and media, and how you approach these projects.
Great, thank you. Phil?
I would just say it's a stick up for municipalities out there. I think that, first of all, the kind of neighborhood, the community perspective, that's going to be there, I think, always. Right? People in the neighborhoods, their wealth is tied up in their home. It's very important to them. They live there every day. It's how it is. And I think most people know that. A lot of the education that my department is doing to our city council, to communities, is actually about development. I think there's a big lack of information among the general public, which is understandable. They're not doing it all the time. Just about how development works and how is a developer different than an investor, different than a financing entity, and what amount of work has happened before someone even shows up at your local community council or neighborhood council with a set of plans. It's significant. A lot of money's expended, and a lot of risk is out there, and land's been acquired. And at the end of the day, the end of the pipeline is generally something that the city is interested in, right? Private investment, eliminating blight, redeveloping buildings. But to the extent that our public decision makers, that our neighbors understand how much and how complex and what levers can be pulled after a year and a half of diligence and what levers can't be pulled, that only helps, I think, to inform what's going on. And honestly, I think you see that distinction inside of our neighborhoods, right? We have some very competent community development corporations that really get that, and there's others that don't yet. And sometimes those community development corporations have to educate their neighborhood councils about how much investment and work has happened to date. I think it's an ongoing educational process for all those involved.
And I know you probably thought I was directing it right now, but I will say, in my experience, the city planning department is probably at its most professional that I've seen it in my 35-year career. And again, I'm glad you're shaking your head, because it was like the Wild West when you would go down to talk to staff. And I do want to compliment, I see a youth movement, I see a diversity movement, and I see a total professionalism. On the legal side, the attorneys that are down there negotiating are from some of the best law firms, and that have taken maybe a decision. So, Phil, I'm not picking on you.
I like that. And to go ahead and chime in, Phil, thank you for sticking up for the city and the municipalities, without a doubt. Just to go ahead and flip the coin a little bit, I think Gregg just told a nice story where he said, hey, 5 years ago, had he gone over to a local municipality, they wouldn't have wanted any kind of development. But as of today, they said, Gregg, give us as many units, give us as many roofs as possible. We've been talking about how the private sector fights for this. The question is to you, start off, Phil. How is it possible that these developers can fight? Or how can they better position themselves for these public dollars?
Well, that's a good question. One, I think, while there have been so many sea changes, and they all happened at the same time, right? Construction costs have gone way up. What we know after the recession is a huge number of laborers left the construction industry and haven't gone back. So those labor costs have gone up, and there went some of the experience as well. At the same time, there's a whole lot more information available about how these projects work and what public funds are going into them and what the tax abatement approvals are. And so basically the whole world, literally every part of the development pipeline has shifted. The construction estimation, bidding, public finance, and incentive. And I think that's one thing, making sure that our decision makers and city administrations understand that world. If what you're after is private investment, then you're going to need to understand that world. And I think even inside of the Department of Community Economic Development in the last few years, we've really changed the way we think about underwriting. It's not just about nominal numbers anymore. It's about commercially reasonable returns. What is a commercially reasonable return, or a range of commercial cash on cash or yield on cash, or whatever you're using. And I think making sure that as a municipality we have at least some of that expertise to have the same conversations back and forth with developers is important. One of the other things we've done is understanding that there are tons of rules for development, and to the extent that we can influence what those rules are or make less of them, then great. We've done downtown, at least in the city, we eliminated all parking requirements for any type of development, office, commercial, any kind of development over the Rhine and downtown and Pendleton. Because do we want parking or do we want development? And so that has gone. And honestly, once we did that, we've had a couple of neighborhoods think, hey, we'd like that too. And so we're starting to move that out into some neighborhood business districts to see if we can get some projects moving there that might have been held up by parking. I have the same perspective about density, especially in places like historic districts. We have, you have already a floor for how many units can be built because of building code. You have a height limitation already. There's a certain number of, do we need a bureaucratic number in between that needs a variance and 6 hearings with the Historic Conservation Board or whatever? Sometimes, some people's answers are yes, but to me, if what we're after is density and private investment, and the density conversation is about affordability too, then can we make efforts to see if we can change the way that the underlying rules are put in place? I don't know, maybe a roundabout way of answering.
No, I think that's a good segue. And then even for Dan, just to go and chime in for the developers, he mentioned affordability. What are some creative things that you guys have done over at Uptown in order to fight for those public dollars, whether it be adding sidewalks or just tackling affordability?
We just really approached our next project in Mount Auburn with a really novel approach on affordability. There's been a lot of pressure in a lot of cities to cramp down affordable units in every project. So if you're building a 200-unit project, 10% have to be affordable, or 10% have to hit a certain threshold. We went to a couple of council members and to Phil and a few others and suggested a different approach to it, which they really liked. Kind of a much more entrepreneurial approach, and an approach that forces a developer to be a mixed income developer versus forcing mixed income into a particular building. And so I'll use our latest structure as an example because I think it can be duplicated effectively. And essentially, we're getting ready to build a 200-unit building in Mount Auburn, and the tax abatement is dependent on creating a certain amount of affordable units within that building. And I said, tell you what, I'm not going to have any affordable units in this building, but I will make sure I bring on 20 affordable units before this building is complete. And there they get all 200 units Class A and 20 units, a minimum of 20 units, brought on at the same time. And so what happens is now we are out seeking an affordable housing project, an affordable housing partner. How do we now fulfill that promise? And we know we can deliver a 20-unit building or a 30 or 40 unit, and it may be much bigger than 20 units, but we know we can fulfill that by the summer of 2022 when this 200-unit building is done. And so what happens is the city doesn't have to subsidize the affordable housing project because we have now taken on that responsibility. The city's going to get that delivered much sooner versus us putting money into an affordable housing trust fund, which in my viewpoint is not a very productive way to solve that problem. And so there are creative and entrepreneurial approaches, and the city, to its credit, was willing to listen to a different approach.
Excellent. And Gregg, go for it.
I think every jurisdiction has different ways to accomplish what you're talking about. We recently finished a project in Louisville, and the city came to us and said, we'd like some affordable units in this building. And we were already on the borderline because we were doing a 7-story building, so we had to build this according to high-rise standards, which adds a tremendous amount of expense to the cost. And so in that case, we went back to the city and said, we're happy to do it, but we can't afford to. So if you guys would like to contribute that, some public dollars, we'll do it. And they came back to us and said, okay, we'll do 2 things. We're going to give you a grant for $1 million, and we're going to give you basically a CRA, a partial abatement, that'll give you another $1.5 million. And based on that, can you do, I think it was 20 or 25 affordable units? And we said, sure, which we did. Those were the first units to lease up, which is really an indication of how great the demand is for workforce and affordable housing. The challenge is, how do we deliver it? we're looking at a site in Naples right now, or a site in Sarasota, and the city there is developing a higher density zoning designation, but along with that comes a requirement for X percentage of the units to be affordable at some percentage of AMI. So there's lots of ways to do it, but it's definitely a challenge and something that we collectively have to address, because based on the basic building cost, land cost, entitlement costs, and everything else, we can't build generally without some kind of subsidy, a product that's affordable to workforce housing. You can't do it.
All right, thank you. Richard?
The affordable housing discussion is going to be the discussion of the next 5 years. Ohio is not in the forefront. If you go to the Northeast, affordable housing statutes are already in place. And what that means is if you go to build a project, and a community will be tested, and if they have to have 10% affordable housing, or let's say 1,000 units, and they don't have it, and Dan and Gregg walk in and they got an affordable housing project, and they're saying, I'm bringing 100 units in, you haven't met you got to get to 1,000 units, you're at 800. That's the easiest zoning case in the world. They have to approve the case because they have to meet that affordable housing criteria. The issue, besides the bricks and mortar and the cost, and Dan, you touched on it, I do a lot of senior housing projects, which are age restricted 55 and older, is when you have a single building versus fee simple. Imagine it's a different issue if you're talking about zero lot lines, cluster housing, fee simple interest people are actually acquiring. But we're talking rental units in a single building. The discussion has to be realistic about, does that work? Because there are certain occupants that are going to say, I will not rent in a building with affordable housing. In which case, does that mean the project's killed because there are states that say you must put the units in? Or is it a monetary compensation to a fund? But I think that this debate, Ohio will be on the edge of this soon. It's just coming. And I hope it's a fair debate, is to allow developers to have the choice and allow the developers to talk about this. Because this is definitely a wave that's moving northeast into the mid-Atlantic states.
Good. So guys, in addition to the affordable piece, what are some other things that you guys have done for the developers to start off with for the city, whether it be fixing fire hydrants? Like, what are some other fun things that you guys have done for the city in order to make your projects work?
Fire hydrants are so fun.
That's it. That's it.
Water lines and curbs and sidewalks.
Yeah.
One other piece on the affordable.
Sure.
When we went into Mount Auburn originally, we had bought 2 essentially vacant apartment buildings, and we knew stepping into Mount Auburn was going to be treacherous if you're coming in to build Class A, because people want to label what you're doing as gentrification, or what are you doing for the current residents of Mount Auburn. And one thing we did immediately before we went and presented our plans for the Wellington project, the 259-unit Class A, was we bought, rehabbed, and delivered 82 workforce housing, affordable and workforce housing, but it was affordable by AMI standards. And we did that before we had a single request. And so we did that strategically and had that in our back pocket because no one was in there rehabbing. And so we actually delivered 82 affordable units, got rehabs, which isn't a big profit center, but it gave us the stripes to be able to work within the neighborhood on that piece. In terms of work we've done, I think everyone would say the same thing. It's infrastructure. It's the new water lines to support your project, and curbs, and new light fixtures and sidewalks. And we, on our project on Views on Vine, we set up a scholarship at the University of Cincinnati as a way to give back to anyone who graduated from high school in any of the 5 neighborhoods of the Uptown could access this scholarship through the UC Foundation. So there's a lot of ways. You really have to understand what are the hot buttons of the municipality or the city at the time that you're working on it.
That's really creative.
I can beat that. Again, we're just after 5 years getting ready to start this project. And this is a conversation about TIFs and CRAs, and again, that project needed that public involvement to succeed, but we also had to do a lot of other things to get it through. As I mentioned, we had to negotiate with the school board. In this case, it was Deer Park Schools, and we made a proposal to them, which they thought was pretty good, but they said they needed to tweak it a little bit. And as it turned out, they really wanted air conditioning in their junior and senior high school, and the bill for that was about $1.2 million. So the deal was that we had to come up with a way to pay them $1.2 million at closing. So we moved some payments forward. The TIF is a 30-year out there. It's a 30-year deal, and we were making agreed payments with them over that 30 years. We moved some of those up so that we could pay that money. The neighbors really did not want our development. Even though the overall benefits are clear, they just didn't want it. And one of the big issues they had was that the values of their homes were going to go down with this development, which most of us sitting here know is not true. But in order to appease them, there are 10 abutting homeowners. We agreed that for a period of 3 years from the date that we closed, we had so much confidence in the area and our project that we would agree to buy any one of those 10 houses at the 2019 auditor's assessed value for a 3-year period. And then more recently, we gave the homeowners group $115,000 for a beautification program for the neighborhood.
I like that. All right. Just to change, everybody good? Just to change directions briefly. Gregg, you mentioned it a moment ago, and I don't want to get cut short on time, how you guys underwrite the TIFs. I'm going to start off with Kyle. Kyle, whether it be a TIF or a tax abatement, for those in the room who need to know this, can you just kick off on the finance side? How do you guys even underwrite this when it comes to acquisitions?
Depends on which one you're looking at, right? So a tax
hit up with both.
So a tax abatement is the absence of a payment, right? Depending on the duration of it, it's a present value calculation. Do we have any appraisers? Are there appraisers in the room? I didn't see any. It's a crap which appraiser you go to. It's a present value calculation. It's a standard tax abatements, 15 years. They'll take a look at what the asset value is with a full tax load, and we can debate on what the actual assessed tax value would be. But they make their best guess of what the full tax value is going to be assessed at, and then they take whatever payment is required to the schools, so it's 25%, and then they do a discounted valuation for that 15 years. Now, what discount rate do they use? We've seen anybody use like a safe rate for a 15-year deal, which would be like 2.5%, which is very low and aggressive, to 5 to 7%. So it's all over the board depending on who you go to from a valuation standpoint. A TIF is essentially bringing 30 years worth of tax payments forward in one capital payment, and that's a present value calculation based on what bond investors are willing to go out and pay for. So that's more of a market driven calculation. Right now, a lot of incentives that we're seeing a few different developers utilize is a 30-year tax increment financing reimbursement payment, where essentially you're going out and doing a TIF and you're paying your full tax amount, but rather than pull all of the money forward, you're receiving a reimbursement check for the differential between the school municipality payment and what the actual payment is. And that would be done in a similar fashion, but 30 years is more of a money good calculation. We see a lot of appraisers, and more specifically investors that are buying real estate with a 30-year duration, just use a market rate cap on the reimbursed total NOI on the property. In the case of Kentucky, where a lot of projects have 30-year industrial revenue bonds, it's from a sales perspective, they're taking a look at the.
We look at it. We're just looking at it from a net operating income perspective and cash flow perspective. If the abatement of the TIF reduces our tax load by 40%, that just factors into whether or not the project's going to succeed from a cash flow perspective. And generally, obviously, 30-year TIF is a lot more valuable to us than a 15-year or a 10-year CRA. But a lot of developers today, we're not one of them, Dan's not one of them, but a lot of them are really merchant builders, and they're building, stabilizing, and selling. And so they're trying to lay off the risk in 7 years or 10 years to the next guy in.
That's a good point. I think one of the questions you put, Sherief, was why would somebody pick one over the other? With a 15-year duration, if you get 10-year permanent financing after your initial construction period, you've got 5 years left on your tax abatement. There's a real estate risk out there from a value standpoint, which can create a problem versus the 30 years eliminates a lot of that.
I really don't have it.
Cool. All right. And in that case, Phil, just to go to kick it over to you. So whether it be 10 years, 15 years, or even a 30-year, in the life of a city, it's a blink. As a city, why wouldn't you guys, unless you're going to be doing like a manufacturing facility right in Hyde Park Square, why wouldn't you guys approve as many projects as possible just to know, hey, in 2030, in 2040, we're going to be having this influx of capital, and you can just project moving forward from here to eternity?
Well, in the world where I have unilateral decision-making authority, it may be different. But the world I live in, the approval process for these public tools is complex. I think at least, and I think this is really true for every municipality. I mean, the way that a property tax abatement or a tax project TIF or a TIF district affects that particular city's funding, income, operations, it could be wildly different. And so I'm really familiar with how tax abatements affect the City of Cincinnati's tax receipts. And at least in a world where we still have the Property Tax Rollback, which Council has voted on again this year, basically the cost to the city for a tax abatement is almost nothing. It's tax increment that especially in a world where the project would move forward without the tax abatement, you can't argue that the city would have gotten those funds anyway, generally, but especially if property tax receipts are capped at $29 million, those property taxes wouldn't have been paid or would have been paid very differently in any case. And so the administration's perspective has obviously evolved over time. We still maintain the position that these property tax incentives should be used on a but-for basis. And last year, I think the number of property tax abatements that were considered and passed by City of Cincinnati City Council was near 100. I think it's also important that the need for those tools is different between municipalities as well. We are a higher poverty city than a lot of our competitors. We are a more historic city than Columbus or Indianapolis. And so that's why you see, if you look at the number of state historic tax credits that are awarded, since we're cleaning up, but we also have a much tougher redevelopment scenario for a lot of our urban infrastructure and private properties. And so yes, we're using these tools a lot, but we're doing so at least with the perspective of minimizing the number of times we're using it. We're using, in the vast majority of cases, there's no cash provided for projects anymore, because it's just simply not there. But we also have to operate in a world in which our city has other challenges than some of our regional and municipal competitors in other places.
Kyle, do you want to weigh in at all for what you're seeing over on the finance side?
I'm good.
All right.
One of the things I think is important, based on what Phil says, is that there are a lot of CRAs that are 7 or 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
And what happens is a guy buys a building with 3 years left on a CRA. What do you think he does at the end of 3 years? He's going back to these guys and saying, hey, I needed another 5 or 10 years. So while those eventually burn off, they don't necessarily burn off when you think they're going.
Yeah, I think, and it is important to say, I think, compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the average probably length of a commercial tax abatement, CRA, approved by council was 14.9 years or something. These days, there are many cases in which it's an 8-year abatement, it's a 10-year abatement. And again, that's per city council requests. We're using these we're being as aggressive as possible to minimize the use of tax incentives. But again, it's a little bit of a dance. As a municipality, if you're playing a game of poker with your cards, you want the development, you want the private investment, you want to eliminate blight, you want to create a development in a neighborhood that hasn't seen it in 40 years. But that's the dance that we do.
Playing devil's advocate.
Yes, attorney.
Put it the developer side, but as being a resident of the city of Cincinnati, you're not going to get a big applause from me on the stadium deal. That is a grossly disproportionate benefit that was given, and I think we're all paying for it still, trying to figure out how to resolve it with diminished sales tax. I don't want to get into the details of that, but I think that people that have read the articles and understand what's happening is that a benefit was given, besides the Bengals stink, and I hope Joe Burrow's So it's not a good thing. But I do think we have to look at these and say, realistically, you got a long-range horizon on these deals, and sometimes they do go sideways. And you got to realize we are paying for this if you're a resident of the city. That's my devil's advocate position.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, all of you guys, so far. We have about 10 minutes left. When we were talking in our pre-panel kind of interviews, I think each of you mentioned a few different types of other public benefit that wasn't necessarily a tax abatement or a TIF agreement. Would anybody care to elaborate on some other forms of, what's the question? What are other forms of public investment or public benefit? We had a parking lot example, some sidewalks, things like that.
The best example that we've had in the last couple of years is in Mount Auburn at Inwood Park. We simply could not have built a $40+ million apartment building on Inwood Park where there literally was someone shot and killed in a bad drug deal while we were in pre-development. And so for us, that was an absolute necessity that $500,000 be put into the capital budget of the city to fund some improvements to that park. And we partnered, and Christ Hospital partnered, and other people partnered, but we had to, at the time it was Willie Carden, and his philosophy of parkonomics, where the park is going to provide uplift to our apartment building, and our apartment building is going to provide uplift to the park. We really needed absolute investment in the park. It didn't need to become Smale Park, but we had to trim some trees, add some lighting, fix the sidewalks, increase police patrols, and fix it. And since then, we've been able to continue to lobby the park board and the city because we've made such tremendous headway. Now there are kids playing in the park, and we have 450 residents now who are walking dogs and throwing frisbees, and we have that park now activated. So that was a great example. Had nothing to do with our deal in terms of it wasn't a tax abatement or a TIF. It was really, hey, city, you got to invest in this park or we can't build this building.
That's great.
Yeah, cash is awesome, right? Capital dollars. Phil, I think that's a little bit harder to come by these days than used to. District TIF dollars, we haven't touched a whole lot on district TIFs, right? So there's all the different districts that are set up throughout the city that are generating increment from rising property tax values that have cash available to apply to public improvements and different improvements in projects. So we see that happen quite a bit as well.
Excellent. All right, I know we're coming to the end, but just to go ahead and throw out, I think we'll go ahead and start with Phil. Moving forward, Cincinnati's made a lot of progress, especially over the last 10 years. In your crystal ball, what do you see happening in the future with Cincinnati faring in comparison to those other cities that you mentioned?
Ooh, that's a good question. Curveball. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that part of that is going to depend on economy. I think obviously everyone in this room knows the building trades and development world is very much tied to the national economy. I think that the city of Cincinnati is really well positioned, much better positioned than we ever have been to compete well for those kinds of capital dollars and private investment. I think that we've done so much of the really hard work, at least locally here in the city of Cincinnati, to put some of the fundamentals in place. 10 years ago, making a case to invest north of Liberty and over the Rhine is different than it was today. And that's because of a lot of hard work and a lot of private development risk over the Rhine. I think you can apply the same thing to our other neighborhoods. We're starting to see in Walnut Hills, in College Hill, in a lot of these, Madisonville, private development has gotten there now. And in the same way that I think Dan said earlier, it's really hard to go to a bank or go to a lender and say, hey, give me money for this project in this neighborhood where there hasn't been anything in 50 years. It's a different thing to go and say, hey, this other thing happened already in Madisonville or Walnut Hills or College Hill. I'm ready for phase 2. And so I'm really hopeful and positive about the future of private development and investment in the city.
I am too. I live in a little bit of a microcosm, but the University of Cincinnati is expanding at an incredible rate. The interchange is an enormous opportunity that really hasn't been touched on here and is going to need a lot of incentive. But we're staring at $1 billion of development at that interchange over the next decade. And then everything that's been going on over the Rhine And we can't skip over what's going on out at the airport, which is just an enormous turnaround from our languishing airport and the Amazon hub and all of the airlines that have come in. And in terms of a regional powerhouse, from the interchange to the airport, I think we're just going to see a tremendous amount of continued development in that corridor.
I would echo those sentiments. I think our region is doing great. I think we need to always remember that, and as Dan said, that it's really not just the city of Cincinnati. It's Hamilton County, it's the other counties, and it's the 3 counties in northern Kentucky. And they're an important part of where we go in the future. One of the things that needs to change, in my opinion, to really keep us moving in the right direction, is the city and county have to figure out a way to work together. That, to me, that is a real impediment today for the continued progress that we are making, but that we need to continue to make. And somehow that's got to get resolved.
Dan really took my 2 points. I think what's going on in Uptown and what's going on down by the airport with the Prime Air Hub are regional game changers for the city to the likes that we don't even really comprehend right at this point. I think it's 10 years from now we're going to look back at that and be amazed at what that does for the city. I think in the next 5 years, I'm very bullish on where the city is going. I think the workforce housing conversation is going to get louder. I think the senior housing conversation is going to get louder. Totally echo what Gregg said as well about the city and the county. Need to find a way to get along, because when the development community has clarity in terms of the rules in which they're working under, capital in a capitalistic society finds a way to get projects done. And the more clarity that we have in politics, the more likely we are to continue to grow the projects in town.
I was asked this question 10 years ago on a CDC committee, and that was a different time. That was 2009, and I was incredibly bullish then. I'm triple bullish now. Why? Yes. The city of Cincinnati, regardless, is still the heartbeat of basically a 7-county region, 3 in northern Kentucky and our 4. And we have a great downtown. If you don't believe it, go look at other downtowns in the Midwest. I want to credit the millennials, because what they did, and I know a lot of those kids that went in and invested in Over the Rhine when everybody was saying that's vertical piles of rubble, they gave us an identity. And I've got 2 30-year-old kids that have come back from the East Coast, Boston and D.C. I would never have been able to entice them to come back. They cannot believe what the city looks like. This is expanded out. In Silverton, you got a major project at 1847. Yep. You've got a major project just completed in Rookwood, which is literally the 3rd phase of Rookwood. Delhi Township just bought their shopping center to secure their core. You've got Trinitas demolishing Deaconess Hospital. Right. By the way, all my projects. And I can just tell you, we're attracting Chicago, Indianapolis developers. It used to have to be local people that would believe in it. We're identified on the map, and I truly believe we are really well positioned. The question will be, whether between the city and the county, will the leadership lead? And if they can't lead, they got to get out of the way, because we've had some good leadership, I think, the last 5 or 10 years, and you got to have good leadership at the top. I remember in Norwood, there was Mayor Sanker the father, there was Hochbein, and there was Sanker the son. Now Tom Williams is retiring. Republicans, Democrats, it didn't matter. They were all pro-development. And I know, Bernie, you're probably laughing, thinking about how I'm going back into history here. Bernie's on Norwood Planning Commission, which I'll give you a check later for that. But what Norwood did with Rookwood was remarkable. Rookwood at one point accounted for 15% of the revenues of their entire city, and that was a city on the verge. And I think we're not that different. We want to think we're that different, but I love the momentum we've got right now.
Yeah, that's great. 5 o'clock. Thank you to all the panelists. I think we're going to open it up for a few minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, do you want to moderate that, or do you want
I would love to. So with that, does anybody have any questions for our panelists?
I had a question.
Mario.
They talked about revenues being good. Panelists talked about revenues being the reason why subsidies and abatements are needed. They focused more on multifamily and retail, a little bit of comment on office. But really the question is, how do you increase revenues? How do you increase revenues? Because we shouldn't be working on perpetuating subsidies. We've got to figure out how to eliminate them so we can reduce our real estate taxes. So I mean, I'm sure we all have ideas, but that's what we need to do, is we need to increase rents. Our multifamily rents are low, our retail rents are low, and as Gregg said, our office rents are low.
I'll take one quick shot at that. At the end of the day, that's a supply and demand issue, which means more jobs. Until the pace of employment, not that unemployment rate is very low, but as we create more jobs, we create more demand, and that drives up revenue, whether it's retail, office, or multifamily. And I forget what the number is of people that are moving into Nashville every day.
It's like 65 people a day or something.
Yeah, but the demand that's creating
There you go, 300 out of
300 people a day.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't think we're quite at that level yet.
We're not there.
But at the end of the day, it's all about growth. We're doing this deal in Orlando, and as much new product is coming online there, the demand continues to outpace that supply because of Orlando's led the country the last 3 years in job growth. And those prices are escalating at a much faster rate there than they are here.
I would argue that these guys are adding revenue. Every time they build a new project, they're getting higher rents, which pushes rents up and everything below it. So the revenue is not fast enough to outweigh the pace of construction cost growth. That really, I think the underlying issue is coming from the pace of construction cost growth in the development community, much like Queen City Tower raised the profile of Class A office rents in the city of Cincinnati, the multifamily developers that are up here raising the profile of Class A multifamily rents, and that is creating opportunity for the B and C class owners to raise rents as well. So I think the revenue side of the equation is increasing. Unfortunately, it's not outpacing the cost increases that are out there to build a product.
I want to comment that, first of all, Dan Schimberg is quietly the most active developer in the city of Cincinnati. And you deserve a pat on the back from everybody in the room for what you've done. I don't think anybody understands how many units you have built in the last 10 years. You have probably outbuilt everybody. But then I also want to say that in the city of Cincinnati, you touched in just recently on the growth in Walnut Hills, the growth in Madisonville, the growth in College Hill. I think those were the communities you named. Every single one of those communities, Dan is the exception to this, every single one of those communities was driven forward by City of Cincinnati investment a decade. Every single one of those communities is thriving on land that was acquired by the City of Cincinnati, demolition that was financed by the City of Cincinnati, stabilization that was enabled by the City of Cincinnati. And we need to be very careful when we talk about how our neighborhoods are growing, because we have 5 neighborhoods that are growing, or we'll call it 6. We have Dan's 2, we have Over the Rhine, we have those 3, and we have Westwood. And those were all, with the exception of Dan, financed by the City of Cincinnati.
Jody, do you have a question?
Yes, you guys have spoken about how expensive the TIF process is. What is the minimum amount of a development needs to be for it to make sense to even go after a TIF?
Repeat that question again.
You were talking about how expensive the TIF process is. As a developer, what's the minimum amount of a development cost would need to be for me as a developer to go after a TIF fund?
What size of project does it have to be to justify going through all the...
I think part of that depends on what your tolerance for pain is.
The lawyers make all the money, so what's the smallest deal you work with?
There's a certain cost to going through the process.
Right.
And so I don't know the answer to that. I know our average deal size right now is in the $30 to $40 million range, and they seem to be 200 unit kind of thing, and they're worth chasing for that. But I don't know.
I've heard everything from $5 million to $10 million is the minimum.
I'd say 5 million.
Yeah.
Does anybody in the
We worked on
audience?
$10, $15 million, not a whole lot smaller than that.
The smallest deal I did was I brought water and sewer lines to Ivy Hills about 20-some years ago. It was like $1.2 million. too, so adjusted for inflation. And that was a skinny deal that we just had to do it. And we haven't talked about this in this meeting. Coming attractions, at March, we may talk about tax credits, okay? I think you got to realize there's another financing vehicle there. And if you look at the chart, most of those residential deals were done through tax credits, either historic and over the line or light tech deals for affordable housing. And we are certainly not going to touch on that.